June 24th of 1340, the waters off of the coast of Flanders became host to one of the bloodiest and most decisive naval battles in medieval history. But how did a fledgling English navy overcome and dominate the much larger and much stronger French navy? The war never would have been fought if Philip of Valois never became King of France, because he wasn't supposed to. Charles IV died with no direct male heir, severing a line of succession that had been in place for over 3 generations, but there was hope. His wife was currently pregnant. There was still a chance of an heir. But when she gave birth to a girl, it resulted in Philip being named King of France, as he was Charles's first cousin. Even though the closest male heir was technically Edward III of England, Philip was preferred by the French nobility. Edward more or less accepted the nomination. In the beginning, Edward never truly desired to become King of France, although this would eventually change. Edward had been conducting raids on the French allied Scots in retaliation and in the interest of not only more wealth, but also reuniting French territory. Philip confiscated Gascony from Edward, declaring it official French territory, and with that declaration, the 100 Years' War started. Gascony was very important to the English economy. Edward III was notoriously bad with money, but wine and wool kept the kingdom above water, and wine was Gascony's chief export. With the war beginning, Edward needed allies, and he found those allies in the semi-independent Flemish mercantile towns of Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres. It was a natural alliance. The Flemings needed English wool for their hundreds of cloth looms and were given generous trade privileges in English markets. But what the Flemings really wanted was for Edward to take the French throne. The Flemings hated King Philip for what they deemed to be a series of betrayals and saw this as the perfect opportunity to get rid of an enemy without being branded as traitors. The French had knowledge of Edward's money problems. Most everyone did. But the French wanted to exacerbate this issue. The French began conducting raids of English ports, namely Weltrin, Portsmouth, and Southampton. The raid at Weltrin was the most embarrassing for the English. 2 of Edward's personal ships happened to be unloading freight, and the French took the opportunity to steal those ships before they could escape, and butchered their crew, dealing a great blow to royal pride. While the raid at Weltrin was the most embarrassing, the raid at Southampton was by far the most brutal. Over 1,000 French soldiers raided the port. Everything they couldn't carry was burned, and anyone unlucky enough to fall into raiding hands was hanged, usually outside their own home. Meanwhile, Edward was engaging in expensive campaigns across northern France, burning everything in his way, hoping that this would lure out King Philip, which it of course did not. It only served to force Edward into bankruptcy, forcing him to take loans from the Italians, loans he would later default on. Following his failure to provoke King Philip, Edward returned to England. His chief concern was with building his own navy. He was well aware of the French's superiority in this area after the raids on his ports. However, England didn't really have a navy at this time. With Edward's 2 ships being stolen, it's believed that the English only had 3 to 4 ships. Instead of ordering ships to be built, which would be a costly process in both time and money, Edward instead arrested merchant ships. Now, this isn't arresting in the way we would think of the term. More of a forceful conscription. The ship's owners and crews were paid out generous wages for their inconvenience, earning double the rate of a regular sailor. This quickly built the English navy to a force of around 160 to 200 ships. While Edward was building his strength and making preparations in England, he was surprised by a French offensive in Cambrai. This led to the development of a new plan. Edward would sail to the greater European continent and wait for his army. Upon their arrival, he would lay siege to the French-held city of Tournai, with a fleet of 40 or so ships. Despite the large fleet he had crafted, many of those arrested ships were finding ways out of their agreements. As we've established, Edward's money issues were very well known, and most believed that he simply didn't have the money to pay out those contracts. Originally, Edward wanted to sail for the city of Tournai in March of 1340, but a series of delays and preparations kept pushing him back. Finally, it was decided that he would sail in June. The French had spies in England and heard of Edward's plans to attack Tournai. They hoped to block his path into the greater European continent at the Sluys estuary. They filled the shallow but wide estuary with a force of about 20,000 men and approximately 240 ships. They hoped to not only block his passage to Tournai, but to overwhelm what they expected to be a small fleet of 40 ships, kill Edward, and then launch an invasion of England. Once Edward learned of the French presence at Sluys, he mounted a considerably larger force of 160 to 200 ships and set sail. Once the English fleet were spotted, it sent the inexperienced French command into a panic. Going against the advice of their more experienced advisors, the French commanders elected to tie their ships together with ropes and chains in rows of about 17 ships, filling the estuary. And it built something of a floating castle, a castle they hoped to be impregnable. When Edward would have approached the estuary, it would have looked like a dense forest had sprouted in the middle of the water, but of course those trees were the masts of ships. Edward was inexperienced in naval combat. In fact, this was his first attempt, but he converted much of his knowledge of land engagements to the sea, and with the stationary French, this would prove to be the perfect approach. While the English repositioned to get the wind at their backs, a few French ships in the first line thought they were retreating. They cut their chains and gave chase. The English, of course, were not retreating and easily overwhelmed those few ships, killing the crews and taking the ships. Edward would send trios of ships at a time, the first boat carrying men-at-arms, which would board the stationary ships, while the second two, filled with longbowmen, would provide ranged support. It was the longbowmen that would prove to be the deciding factor, as they were able to shoot faster than the French crossbows. The battle raged all day, with Edward fighting alongside his men as though he was a regular soldier or knight and not the King of England. Even if it became clear to the French command that they would not win this battle, they were unable to retreat as they had drifted east and the ropes and chains became tangled together. French soldiers were thrown into the water, drowning just as often as they were pierced by a blade. It was even joked by the English that if the fish could speak, that it would be French, from the amount of men who drowned. The entire French fleet was either captured or destroyed. The battle was incredibly one-sided. It's estimated that the French lost between 16 to 20,000 men, with the English only losing 400 to 600. In the battle, Edward recaptured his personal ships that were stolen at Weltrin. The estuary was wide, but it was shallow. The water would have been filled with corpses. The tide washed up bodies for days to come. This battle ended any French dreams of an invasion into England. It also served to cripple their navy for a time. This battle is often romantically thought of when the English gained permanent dominance into the English Channel, which isn't entirely true. It did give them short-lived control over those waters, but it was control which would still be greatly contested throughout history.